The garden shears fell from Marcus Wellington's calloused hands, clattering against the stone pathway as he stood frozen, watching the white Range Rover screech to a halt just inches from where he'd been kneeling. The man who emerged wore a designer suit that probably cost more than most people earned in 3 months, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from never being told no. "You incompetent fool!" Richard Hastings barked, his voice echoing across the manicured lawns of the Ashford Estate. "Do you have any idea whose car you almost scratched with your filthy tools? I should have you fired. Better yet, deported back to whatever village you crawled out of." Marcus said nothing. He simply bent down, retrieved his shears, and continued trimming the rose bushes with steady, practiced movements. This only seemed to infuriate Richard more. "Did you hear me, boy? I'm speaking to you." Richard stepped closer, his expensive shoes crushing the delicate petals that had fallen onto the pathway. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Other staff members had begun to gather at a distance, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. They knew Marcus. Quiet, dignified Marcus who arrived before dawn and stayed past sunset, who treated every plant and tree on the estate like it was something precious. But they didn't know everything about him. Nobody did. "Sir," Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and measured with a distinct Nigerian accent, "I apologize if my presence here disturbs you. Perhaps you should speak with Mrs. Ashford about." "Mrs. Ashford?" Richard let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "That doddering old woman who lets people like you infest her property? She's in the hospital, in case you hadn't heard. Which means I'm in charge of this estate now. I'm her nephew, and soon this will all be mine. So when I tell you to move, you move. When I tell you to leave, you leave. Understand?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Hastings." "Good. Now get out of my sight before Richard's phone rang, interrupting his tirade. He answered it with an irritated snap. "What?" "Yes. I'm at the estate now." "The reading of the will? That's not until—" "What do you mean it's starting in 10 minutes?" His face went pale. "But she's not even fine." "Fine. I'll be right there." He shoved his phone into his pocket and glared at Marcus one final time. "This conversation isn't over, Gardner. When I inherit this place, you'll be the first one gone." As Richard stormed back to his car and sped toward the main house, Marcus stood motionless among the roses, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, not to wipe sweat, but to clean his hands with deliberate care. Then he began walking toward the main house. 3 years earlier, Marcus Wellington had arrived at the Ashford Estate on a morning thick with summer heat, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter of introduction. He hadn't come looking for work, he'd come looking for peace. In Nigeria, Marcus had been Dr. Marcus Wellington, one of the most successful agricultural entrepreneurs in West Africa. His organic farming cooperative had employed over 2,000 people across 5 states, transforming barren land into flourishing gardens that fed entire communities. He'd been featured in international magazines, invited to speak at conferences in Geneva and New York, courted by investment firms worth billions. Then came the accident. His wife, Amara, and their 10-year-old daughter, Zainab, had been driving to meet him at one of the farms when a truck driver, falling asleep at the wheel, crossed into their lane. The impact killed them instantly. Marcus had arrived at the scene 20 minutes later to find his entire world reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. The months that followed were a blur of grief and rage. He sold his company, donated most of the money to charity, and disappeared. He couldn't bear to be in Nigeria anymore, couldn't stand the sympathetic looks, the business associates who wanted to help him get back on his feet, as if he could simply restart his life like a stalled engine. Through a friend of a friend, he'd heard about an elderly American woman living in Ghana who needed someone to manage her estate gardens. Eleanor Ashford was a widow who'd fallen in love with West Africa decades ago and had maintained a second home there ever since. She was looking for a head gardener, someone who understood African plants and could help her create something beautiful. Marcus took the job, not because he needed the money, but because he needed to work with his hands again. He needed to make things grow. Mrs. Ashford had been in her late 70s then, sharp as a tack despite her age, with kind eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls. "You're running from something," she'd said during their first meeting, sipping tea on her veranda overlooking the gardens. "That's all right. My gardens have always been a refuge for broken things. Plants, people, we all need somewhere to heal."
She didn't pry.
She didn't ask about his past beyond the basics. She simply gave him the freedom to work, to pour his grief into the soil, to lose himself in the rhythm of planting and pruning and watching things bloom. Over the next 3 years, Marcus transformed her gardens into something extraordinary. But more than that, he and Mrs. Ashford became genuine friends. She told him about her late husband, about her disappointment in her family back in America, particularly her nephew Richard, who only called when he wanted money. Marcus told her about Amara and Zainab, about the life he'd lost. "My family thinks I'm foolish for staying here," Mrs. Ashford confided one evening. "They want me back in America, where they can keep an eye on me. What they really mean is keep an eye on my money." "Then why go back?" Marcus had asked. "Because I'm dying, Marcus." She'd said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity.
"Cancer.
"The doctors here have done what they can, but I want to spend my final months at my estate in Virginia, in the house where I grew up. And I want you to come with me. Someone needs to protect what I've built there. Someone I trust." Marcus had agreed, and 6 months ago, they'd made the journey to America together. The Virginia estate was 10 times the size of the Ghana property, 60 acres of rolling hills, ancient oak trees, and gardens that had been neglected for years. Mrs. Ashford had given him complete authority to restore them, and he'd thrown himself into the work with renewed purpose. But Mrs. Ashford had done something else, something Marcus wouldn't. The main house of the Ashford Estate stood like a monument to old American wealth, white columns, wraparound porches, and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the afternoon light. As Marcus approached, he could see several luxury cars parked in the circular driveway. The vultures had gathered. He entered through the kitchen door, as he always did, nodding to Maria, the head housekeeper who'd worked for the Ashfords for 30 years. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "The family is." "I know, Maria. Mrs. Ashford asked me to attend. But Richard is in there, and after what just happened outside. It's all right." Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Everything is going to be all right." In the grand sitting room, Richard Hastings held court like he already owned the place. He'd removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and was pointing at various pieces of furniture while talking to a thin woman in pearls, his wife, Vanessa, about which items they'd keep and which they'd auction off. "The Rembrandt in the study alone should fetch $2 million, Richard was saying. "And this room would make an excellent home theater once we got it." "Mr. Hastings," a crisp voice interrupted. Patricia Morrison, Mrs. Ashford's attorney for 40 years, stood in the doorway with a leather portfolio under her arm. She was a black woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles in courtrooms. "We're ready to begin the reading of the will." "Finally," Richard muttered. "Let's get this over with. It's been a long day, and I've already had to deal with." He stopped mid-sentence as Marcus entered the room, now wearing a clean shirt he'd retrieved from his cottage. Marcus took a seat in one of the chairs near the window, his face unreadable. "What is he doing here?" Richard demanded, his face flushing red. "Patricia, this is a private family matter. The gardener has no business." "Mr. Wellington is here at Mrs. Ashford's specific request," Patricia said coolly. "He has every right to be present. Now, if everyone would please sit down, we can proceed." Richard glared at Marcus, but said nothing more, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Vanessa whispered something in his ear, but he shook her off irritably. Patricia opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick document. The last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Ashford, updated and notarized 6 months ago. She began reading the standard legal preamble, then moved to the specific bequests. "To my housekeeper, Maria Santos, I leave the sum of $200,000 and the cottage on the east side of the property, with the stipulation that she may live there rent-free for the remainder of her life." Maria, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, gasped and began to cry. Several other staff members received generous sums, amounts that made Richard shift impatiently in his seat. Yes, yes, very generous, he said. Now, about the estate itself. I'm getting to that, Mr. Hastings. Patricia's tone could have frozen water. To my nephew, Richard Hastings, I leave my collection of first edition books, valued at approximately $50,000, and my late husband's pocket watch. I hope these items will remind you that some things are valuable because of what they represent, not what they cost. The room went silent. Richard's face had gone from red to white. That's it? Books and a watch? There must be some mistake. There's no mistake. The remainder of Mrs. Ashford's estate, including this house, all 60 acres of land, her investment portfolio valued at approximately $12 million, and all other properties and assets, are left to. Patricia paused, her eyes moving from Richard to Marcus, Dr. Marcus Wellington, with the express wish that he continue to maintain and develop the estate as a place of beauty and refuge. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Vanessa had gone pale, gripping her pearls so tightly her knuckles were white. Marcus remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. This is fraud. Richard finally exploded, his voice cracking. That man has manipulated her. He's a con artist who wormed his way into a dying woman's life. Mrs. Ashford was of completely sound mind when she made these changes, Patricia said firmly. I have medical documentation from 3 independent doctors confirming this. She made her wishes very clear. I'll contest this. I'll tie this up in court for years. That estate is my birthright, my family's legacy. Richard was shouting now, advancing toward Patricia's chair. Mr. Hastings, I would strongly advise. I don't care about your advice. That gardener, that immigrant, he's stolen what's rightfully mine. Do you know who I am? Do you know what kind of lawyers I can afford? Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the room. Yes, Mr. Hastings. I know exactly who you are. You're a man who called your aunt doddering while she fought cancer. A man who measured her life in auction prices and real estate values. A man who sees people like me, people who work with their hands, as somehow less than human. He stood, and suddenly his presence seemed to fill the entire room. This wasn't the humble gardener who'd been trimming roses an hour ago. This was Dr. Marcus Wellington, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd commanded boardrooms and negotiated with ministers. Your aunt knew who you were too, Richard. That's why she made the choice she did. Richard lunged forward, but Patricia stepped between them. Mr. Hastings, if you lay one hand on Mr. Wellington, I will have you arrested for assault. And it will not help your case if you choose to contest the will. Oh, I'm contesting it. Richard snarled. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. He grabbed Vanessa's arm and stormed toward the door, then turned back with pure venom in his eyes. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, gardener. Because I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to dig into every corner of your past until I find something, anything, to prove you manipulated my aunt. And when I do, I'll take everything from you. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Patricia turned to Marcus. He will contest it, you know. This could get ugly. Marcus nodded slowly. Let him. I'm leaving you the resources to build whatever you dream. A school, perhaps. A community garden. A place where people can heal the way you healed in my gardens in Ghana. You know better than anyone that what we build with our hands and hearts is the only legacy that truly matters. Don't let Richard's bitterness poison this gift. He's angry because he knows he can never buy what you have, dignity, purpose, and the ability to turn grief into something beautiful. Live well, my friend, and make my gardens bloom. With love and gratitude, Eleanor. Marcus folded the letter carefully, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Outside, he could hear Richard's Range Rover peeling out of the driveway, spraying gravel in its wake. But inside, surrounded by the people Mrs. Ashford had truly cared about, Marcus finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. He'd been given not just an estate, but a second chance at purpose. And Richard Hastings's threats didn't frighten him at all, because Marcus had already lost everything once. He knew exactly how strong that made him. The next 3 weeks were a storm of legal threats, media attention, and Richard Hastings's increasingly desperate attempts to overturn the will. He filed motions, hired private investigators, and even gave an interview to a local news station claiming that Marcus had exploited a vulnerable elderly woman. Marcus said nothing publicly. He simply continued his work. Every morning, he rose before dawn and walked the estate grounds, planning and planting. He hired back the 3 gardeners Richard had fired during his brief, presumptuous tenure as acting manager. He met with architects about converting the old stable building into a community center. He contacted agricultural professors at nearby universities about partnership programs. The staff watched him with growing respect and curiosity. This quiet man who knelt in the dirt beside them for months turned out to have degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. He'd built schools in rural Nigeria. He'd advised the UN on sustainable farming practices. Yet he still insisted on being called Marcus, still took his lunch with the groundskeepers, still got his hands dirty every single day. "Why didn't you tell us?" Maria asked him one afternoon as they shared coffee in the kitchen. Marcus smiled gently. "Tell you what? That I used to have money and status?" Mrs. Ashford understood something important, Maria. She knew that I needed to be just Marcus for a while. Not Dr. Wellington, not the successful businessman, not the man who lost his family. Just someone who plants things and watches them grow. And now I'm ready to be both. The man who works the soil and the man who can create opportunities for others to do the same. But Richard wasn't finished. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the will reading, Marcus received a call from Patricia Morrison. "He's found something," she said without preamble. "Or thinks he has. He's filed a motion claiming you entered the country on false pretenses, that you misrepresented your credentials to Mrs. Ashford." Marcus frowned. "That's absurd. I have all my documentation." "I know. But he's also claiming emotional manipulation, saying you deliberately targeted a lonely widow and isolated her from her family. He's painting a picture of you as a sophisticated con artist who saw an opportunity and took it." "What does this mean for the estate?" "It means a court hearing. Next week. You'll need to testify, and Richard's lawyers will try to tear apart your character and your relationship with Mrs. Ashford." Patricia paused. "Marcus, they're going to bring up your wife and daughter. They're going to suggest you used your grief as a manipulation tactic." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Let them try." The hearing took place in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled of old leather and furniture polish. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 expensive lawyers, looking confident and righteous. He'd dressed conservatively, navy suit, understated tie, the picture of a concerned family member fighting for justice. Marcus wore a simple gray suit and sat calmly beside Patricia, his hands folded on the table. Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Jameson, was good at his job. He painted Marcus as a calculating opportunist who'd researched Eleanor Ashford's wealth before coincidentally becoming her employee. He questioned why a man with Marcus's credentials would take a simple gardening job. He suggested the whole relationship had been a long con. "Isn't it true, Mr. Wellington, that you knew Mrs. Ashford was a wealthy woman before you ever met her?" "I knew she had resources, yes." "And isn't it convenient that a man fleeing financial troubles in Nigeria would suddenly appear in her life?" "I wasn't fleeing financial troubles. I was grieving my family. Or so you claim. But we have no way to verify your story, do we? No proof of this tragic accident you described so movingly." Patricia stood immediately. "Your Honor, that's outrageous. Dr. Wellington has provided death certificates, news reports. I'm simply establishing that my client has reason to question Mr. Wellington's narrative, Your Honor." The judge, a black woman in her 50s named Richardson, looked unimpressed. "Move on, Mr. Jameson." But Jameson wasn't done. He presented phone records showing that Mrs. Ashford had called Marcus frequently during her final months. He showed bank records indicating Marcus had refused salary payments, which Jameson spun as a calculated move to appear selfless. You wanted to seem above money, didn't you? So that when you asked for something much larger, an entire estate, it wouldn't seem out of character? I never asked Mrs. Ashford for anything except the chance to work. But you accepted everything she offered, didn't you? The cottage, the authority over staff, her complete trust. You isolated her from her family. That's a lie, Marcus said quietly but firmly. Mrs. Ashford invited Richard to visit many times. He came twice in 6 months, both times to ask for money. She called him weekly. He rarely answered. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then Patricia stood for the defense, and the tide began to turn. She presented the video recordings Mrs. Ashford had made, hours of footage showing a woman in complete control of her faculties, explaining exactly why she'd made her decisions. In one video, Mrs. Ashford sat in her garden, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees Marcus had pruned. She spoke directly to the camera. I know Richard will contest my will.
He's predictable that way.
So I want to make my intentions crystal clear. Marcus Wellington came into my life when I was dying and lonely. But he never treated me like a dying woman or a lonely one. He treated me like a fellow human being who loved gardens and good conversation. He shared his pain with me, and I shared mine with him. That's called friendship, not manipulation. She leaned forward, her eyes intense despite her illness. Richard thinks he deserves my estate because we share blood. But blood doesn't make family, love does, respect does, showing up does. Marcus showed up every single day. Not because he wanted something from me, but because he understood what I was trying to build. A legacy that matters. The courtroom was silent as the video played. Even Jameson seemed. When the testimony ended, Judge Richardson looked at both parties. I'll review all the evidence and issue a ruling within 30 days. But I want to say something now. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Hastings, I've presided over many inheritance disputes, and they usually come down to one thing. Someone feels entitled to something they didn't earn. Your aunt had every right to leave her property to whomever she chose. The evidence shows she was competent, thoughtful, and very clear about her wishes. Richard's face had gone red. Your Honor, that man, Judge Richardson interrupted, sat with your aunt in her final months while you were, according to phone records, mostly unreachable. This court will make a final determination, but I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment. As they left the courtroom, Richard confronted Marcus in the hallway, his composure finally cracking completely. You think you've won, he hissed. You think you can just come to this country and take what's ours? Marcus looked at him with something like pity. Richard, I didn't take anything. Your aunt gave me a gift, yes, but not because I asked for it. Because she saw something in me that she never saw in you. The ability to value something more than its price tag. Spare me your philosophy, Gardner. You're still just an immigrant who got lucky. No, Marcus said softly. I'm a man who lost everything and learned what actually matters. That's something all your money could never teach you. He walked away, leaving Richard trembling with rage in the marble hallway. 3 weeks later, Judge Richardson issued her ruling. The will would stand. Marcus Wellington was the rightful owner of the Ashford Estate. Richard's motion was denied, and he was ordered to pay court costs. But the story didn't end there. Because what happened next would change not just the estate, but the entire community around it. 6 months after the court ruling, the Ashford Estate had transformed into something Eleanor would have loved. Marcus had converted the old stable building into a community center offering free classes in sustainable farming, financial literacy, and job skills training. The West Garden had become an organic farm where local families could volunteer and take home fresh produce. The greenhouse now served as a classroom where children from nearby schools learned about botany and environmental science. But Marcus's most ambitious project was just beginning, the Eleanor Ashford Agricultural Academy, a full scholarship program for young people from underserved communities who wanted to study farming, horticulture, or environmental science. The first class of 15 students would start in the fall. The local news had caught wind of the transformation, and suddenly Marcus wasn't just the man who'd inherited an estate. He was a story of redemption, innovation, and the power of genuine generosity. Camera crews came to document the community programs. Magazines wrote features. Universities reached out about partnerships. Richard Hastings watched all of this from a distance, his bitterness growing with each article, each success. He'd moved back to Boston after the court ruling, but he couldn't let it go. His business associates whispered about his embarrassing loss to a gardener. His wife had left him, tired of his obsession with the estate. He'd spent a fortune on legal fees and had nothing to show for it. On a humid Saturday morning in July, Richard drove back to Virginia. He'd been drinking, not enough to be impaired, but enough to fuel his rage. He pulled up to the estate gates, which now had a sign reading, Eleanor Ashford Agricultural Academy, cultivating tomorrow's leaders. The gates were open for a community open house. Families walked the paths Marcus had restored, children ran through the gardens, and volunteers served food from the community kitchen. It was everything the estate had never been under the Hastings family, alive, purposeful, welcoming. Richard found Marcus in the main garden, showing a group of teenagers how to properly prune tomato plants. He was patient and encouraging, his hands moving with practiced ease as he demonstrated the technique. "Quite the show you've put on," Richard said loudly, interrupting the lesson. Marcus looked up, his expression neutral. "Hello, Richard. Would you like a tour of—" "I don't want a tour of what should be mine." Richard's voice carried across the garden, drawing attention. Several security volunteers began moving closer. "I want to know how you sleep at night, knowing you stole an old woman's fortune." The teenagers looked uncomfortable, but Marcus remained calm. "Class, why don't you practice what we just learned? I'll be right back." He walked toward Richard, gesturing to a quiet area away from the crowd. "You've been drinking, so what if I have? You've taken everything from me. My inheritance, my family's legacy, my reputation. And for what? So you can play the hero for these people?" Richard gestured dismissively at the families enjoying the open house. "Eleanor left me this estate because she trusted me to honor her vision. That's exactly what I'm doing. Her vision was poisoned by you. She was my aunt, my blood, and you manipulated her into abandoning her own family." Marcus's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "Your aunt tried for years to have a relationship with you, Richard. She called, she invited you to visit, she asked about your life. You only showed up when you needed money. The manipulation wasn't mine, it was your own neglect." "You self-righteous." Richard stepped forward aggressively, but two security volunteers immediately positioned themselves nearby. "Mr. Hastings," one of them said firmly, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm not going anywhere. This is my family's property." "Actually," Marcus said quietly, "it's not. The courts have ruled, Richard. Multiple times. You need to let this go. For your own sake." Something in Marcus's tone, not triumphant, but genuinely concerned, seemed to break through Richard's anger. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked less like an entitled heir and more like a lost, lonely man. "She was my aunt," he said, his voice cracking. "She practically raised me after my parents died. And in the end, she gave everything to a stranger." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unexpected gentleness. "She gave you exactly what you needed, Richard. Not money, but a lesson. The same lesson I had to learn when I lost my wife and daughter, that what we build with love and purpose is the only thing that truly lasts. Your aunt didn't reject you. She tried to teach you what really matters. By giving away my inheritance? By showing you that inheritance isn't owed, it's earned through love, presence, and character. She left you her books and your grandfather's watch because those things held memories, held meaning. That was never worthless, Richard. You just couldn't see it." Richard stood there, the fight draining out of him. Around them, the open house continued. Children laughing, families learning, a community coming together in a space that had been closed off for generations. "I don't know how to let this go," Richard admitted quietly. "Then don't," Marcus said. "Instead, let it change you. Your aunt believed people could grow, could become better. That's why she invested in education, in second chances. There's a place for you here, Richard. Not as an owner, but as someone who could honor her memory by contributing something meaningful. Richard looked at him incredulously. You're offering me what? Charity.
No.
An opportunity. The Academy needs board members, people with business experience to help guide it. Your aunt's legacy could be yours too, if you choose to build something instead of tearing things down. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his car. Marcus watched him go. Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to Eleanor's final letter to him. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't redemption. But it was a beginning. That evening, as the sun set over the gardens, Marcus stood on the porch of the main house and looked out over the estate. In the distance, he could see the lights coming on in the community center, hear the laughter of the evening cooking class. The greenhouse glowed softly, filled with seedlings that would become next season's harvest. He thought about Amara and Zainab, about the life he'd lost and the life he'd found. He thought about Eleanor, who'd given him not just property but purpose. And he thought about Richard, carrying the weight of his own mistakes. The garden shears he'd dropped 6 months ago still hung in the tool shed, cleaned and ready for use. Marcus still used them every morning, still got dirt under his fingernails, still found peace in the simple act of making things grow. Because in the end, that was what mattered, not the money, not the estate, not even the victory in court. What mattered was what you built, what you nurtured, what you left behind for others to harvest. Marcus smiled and went inside. Tomorrow there was work to do, students to teach, gardens to tend. Tomorrow there was always the possibility of growth. And that, he'd learned, was everything. Now, before we close this chapter of Marcus's journey, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know. Where are you watching this story from? Are you in the United States, Nigeria, Ghana, the UK, or somewhere else entirely? I love connecting with viewers from all around the world. And here's something to think about. What would you have done if you were in Marcus's position? Would you have stayed quiet when Richard insulted you, or would you have revealed who you really were right away? Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly because of their job or appearance, only to discover there was so much more to their story? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about how we treat others, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one, and share this video with your friends and family. Stories like Marcus's remind us that dignity, hard work, and character matter more than any title or bank account. Let's spread that message together.